I've so often wondered what it was like to fly aboard Concorde, traveling through the stratosphere at twice the speed of sound, making the flight from New York to Europe in less than 3 hours. Unfortunately, as it is no longer in operation, I will not be able to do that. So I will have to content myself with dining like they did on board, with this meal of lobster with shallot beurre blanc and Scottish smoked salmon with caviar. So thank you to Bombas for sponsoring this video as we dine aboard Concorde, this time on Tasting History. I was inspired to make this video after getting the Lego Concorde that you see behind me, fantastic build, and as soon as I decided to do the video, I went onto eBay to see if I could find any plates or silverware from the 70s that were on the airplane. And not only did I find a good number of them, but the man who sold them to me had actually been one of the cooks for the Concorde in 1977 when it started flying from JFK to Heathrow. How freaking cool is that? His name is John Ninivaggi, and at 22 years old, while working under Henri Prieto, they cooked 208 meals every day to be served on the 2 flights leaving JFK. So I was able to ask him about his experiences and, most importantly, if he remembered any of the actual recipes that they used. Unfortunately, it turns out they didn't use recipes at all. The chef came up with the dishes and then everything was kind of done orally, and so nothing got written down. And since I work from recipes here on the show, I am actually looking at the recipes of Paul Bocuse, the great French chef who designed the menu for the very first flights for Concorde. Now, as I look through different menus to decide on exactly what to make, certain dishes seem to appear more often than others. Things like steak, duck, venison, and of course, lobster. And many of the very early flights seem to serve lobster as well as Scottish smoked salmon with creme fraiche and caviar. Very expensive, but what do you expect when you're paying $9,000 for a one-way ticket, at least in today's dollars? So using the recipes of Paul Bocuse as a guide, I will endeavor to recreate one of the first meals on one of those early flights. And we're going to start with the easier dish, which is the Scottish smoked salmon and caviar. And sometimes these things were served separately, sometimes together, all different ways. But they weren't served, it seems, as a very tall hors d'oeuvre or canapé stacked on top of each other, and the reason was made evident in one of the very first flights. They tried these new canapés that had a lot of stuff on each individual dish, and on takeoff, it all tipped over and we couldn't use them. Caviar all over the floor. So instead of stacking them high, I'm going to try to recreate an image that I actually saw of these being served, and that is kind of as a rose. So start by taking 4 or 5 slices of the smoked salmon and lay them in a line and have each piece slightly overlap the one beneath. Then we are going to roll them up. Not too tight, but tight enough that they will keep their shape. Then once rolled, if it is more than about 1 inch wide, you can slice it in the middle so it'll make 2 even spirals. Then splay the ends a little bit so they kind of look like a rose. I'm sure this takes a lot of practice to really get right. Place that on the plate and then pipe just a little bit of creme fraiche in the center of each rose, and if you like, you can do an extra dollop on a little piece of salmon to the side. Then we need some caviar. Now on Concorde, they used beluga caviar, and I looked around, I couldn't find any, and frankly, at $300 an ounce, I didn't look that hard. But I did find some white sturgeon caviar, which is still a hefty $80 an ounce, so that's what I'm using. Luckily, an ounce actually goes a long way, just a little dabble do ya. Now, caviar is a particularly appropriate food for eating in an airplane, not because it's expensive, but because it is salty. Because when you are 60,000 feet in the air, which is how high Concorde flew, and in a very low humidity environment, which is how all planes are, your taste buds just don't work as well, especially when it comes to tasting sweet and tasting salty. So caviar kind of fixes that. Now we move on to the lobster with beurre blanc sauce. Let's start with the sauce. You'll need 1 3/4 sticks or 200 grams of softened butter, 2 shallots, 2 tablespoons of red wine vinegar, and a pinch of salt and pepper very finely ground. So start by peeling the shallots and chopping them up, and you want to make the smallest pieces that you possibly can. Then put those in a heavy saucepan. The heavier the better because it will retain the heat so you can melt the butter. And then add in the red wine vinegar and then set that on the stove over medium heat. Start to give it a stir as the liquid evaporates, and you want to leave it simmering until all of the liquid is gone and only the shallots remain. Then turn off the heat and add in the butter just a couple tablespoons at a time, stirring quickly as the butter melts. Once melted, you can add the next couple tablespoons and continue until all of the butter is melted, and if it cools off too much and it stops melting, you can set it over a double boiler or over a very, very low heat. You don't want anything to burn or scorch, just warm enough that that butter melts. But as the butter melts, it doesn't look like melted butter, but rather more like a cream sauce. Then add the salt and the pepper and keep that sauce warm while you cook your lobster tails, for which you will need some lobster tails quite obviously, but then you'll also need some sweet paprika and a little melted butter. Start by using kitchen shears to cut the top of the lobster shell all the way down to the tail, but leave the tail uncut. Then flip it over and break the bottom of the tail to help loosen the meat, and then you need to loosen the meat on top as well. For this you can use a knife or you can use your fingers. Then you want to remove the dark vein, which is actually the digestive tract, running down the center of the meat, and then pull the meat out, leaving it attached at the base. Then close the shell back up and lay the meat on top. Now you can actually remove the meat completely from the shell if you want to. This is really just for presentation. Also for presentation is to sprinkle a little paprika on top. It really doesn't add much flavor, but it makes it look nice. Then set the lobster tails on a baking sheet and bake in the oven at 375 degrees Fahrenheit, 190 Celsius for about 10 minutes if you have 2 lobster tails. It's really kind of dependent on the size of them. What you're looking for is an opaque meat, and the temperature should be about 135 degrees Fahrenheit. Then brush a little of the melted butter on them and set them back in the oven, this time with the broiler on, for just a couple of minutes. And while they finish cooking, I wanted to let you know that I am going to be leading 3 more cruises. I've already done a couple down the Nile and down the Danube, and I'm doing 3 more. I have one this November, starting in Paris, going down the Seine, and then we have Colombia and Vietnam and Cambodia next year. So if you want to sign up for those, I will put a link in the description. Unfortunately, while I wish you could take Concorde to get to Paris, you can't because it hasn't run in well over 20 years. So the next best thing I can offer is that you imagine yourself on board Concorde, which you can do once I tell you a little bit more about what that experience would be like. Concorde is the most famous and definitely most successful of the SSTs, or supersonic transports. It was developed as a partnership between the French and the British governments, who shared the expense 50-50. Though there seems to have been constant bickering between the two governments about pretty much everything, including the name. See, the word Concorde means harmony in French, and it also means harmony in English, but in English there is no E at the end. In French, there is an E at the end. So ironically, there was a lot of bickering over which form of the word harmony, Concorde, should be used. And in the end, obviously, the French won because there is an E there, but it is said that the British only allowed this if they could say that the E stood for excellence. Good job, British government. Now, after years of development, Concorde made its first flight in 1969, but it was not a passenger flight, but they still had a full menu developed. This was the menu created mostly by the French chef Paul Bocuse, though it seems the dessert was left up to Gaston Lenôtre. He was a famous pastry chef at the time, and he created the Gâteau Concorde, or Concorde cake, and this was a chocolate cake with different layers of chocolate mousse and chocolate meringue, and then covered in kind of a shell of chocolate shavings. And it is said to have been made for the Concorde, but I couldn't find it on any of the menus, so maybe it was just kind of a one-time thing. Maybe it's on some of the French menus. They're harder to find, at least for me, than the British Airways, but I never saw it, but I'd still like to make it one day. But if passengers weren't getting this Concorde cake on the Concorde, then what were passengers eating? Well, your culinary journey actually began before boarding the plane. See, when Concorde began commercial flights on January 21st, 1976, every seat was essentially first class. The planes only had about 100 seats, and every one of them was sold at a premium, about $9,000 one way in today's money. So at those kind of prices, one would expect a bit of a lounge experience when at the airport, and dedicated Concorde lounges were created at all of the major airports that it went in and out of. When the lounge at JFK opened, the enormous room spanned 2 stories and thousands of square feet, an oasis of tranquility reserved exclusively for Concorde's 100 passengers. Daylight streamed through huge floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden glow across the inviting modern interior. The decor exuded an understated elegance, with smart leather couches, club chairs, and polished tables arranged for effortless comfort. While you waited, champagne and other beverages were served as you walked up to the buffet, and there was pastry, fresh pastry and fruit and all sorts of other breakfast items, and they even had a chef who was making omelets to order. Then it is time for you to actually board the plane. Due to the size of the cabin, space was rather limited. The seats were small, there wasn't much overhead room, and there were restrictions on how much luggage you could bring. Add to that the fact that it got quite warm inside as you traveled at 1,300 miles an hour, and it paled in comparison with the usual first-class experience of the day. The plane actually got so hot at those supersonic speeds that the metal frame would actually expand during flight, so the plane was 2 inches longer up in the air than it was down on the ground. But it is not the heat or lack thereof or the size that made it a luxury experience. What did make flying on Concorde a luxury experience was the fact that you were going 1,300 miles an hour. You were less concerned with comfort when your flight time was less than half of what everyone else's was. Because at that time, and still today really, a flight from JFK to Heathrow could be about 7 to 7.5 hours. On Concorde, it was about 3 hours. Speed was the selling point for Concorde. It actually wasn't sold as a luxury experience, but rather as a tool for diplomats and businessmen. You could leave London in the morning and arrive at JFK before you actually left London. You were going so fast. It was time travel. Then you could have a business meeting in Manhattan at lunch, head back to the Concorde, and be back in London before dinner. It was absolutely incredible, especially when you think in the late 70s and early 80s, there would have still been people around who could remember the time that that same journey took 5 days on a transatlantic ocean liner. 5 days, 3 hours. Insane. Now perhaps nothing illustrates the speed with which Concorde flew better than when on July 13th, 1985, Phil Collins opened the Live Aid concert at Wembley Stadium, then boarded Concorde, flew to New York, took a helicopter from New York to JFK Stadium in Philadelphia, and closed the concert there. He opened it and he closed it on different continents. But even though speed was the main reason for flying on Concorde, at the prices that they were charging, people still expected some degree of luxury. One degree of luxury was the fact that most of the flight there was absolutely no turbulence. Now, takeoff and landing were known to be very turbulent because they had to take off and land at really steep angles. But once you got up to 60,000 feet, you're above all of the weather, so there ain't no turbulence. Also at those heights, one could observe the curvature of the Earth. Truly a luxury experience. And then, as soon as you hit cruising altitude, the feast could begin. 6 flight attendants would begin serving cocktails, Dom Perignon champagne, and canapés. Meals on the first flights included lobster with caviar canapés, filet mignon, a palm heart salad with Roquefort dressing, and then strawberries and cream with more champagne. Nearly every menu had options for fish or chicken or steak, along with the occasional duck, pheasant, venison, or on British Airways, game pie. Veal was a very popular dish, and even in 1977, it sold for $22.50 a pound. That's about $120 today. According to John Ninavaji, the cook who was there in those early flights, who sold me all of my plates, the veal was actually the only thing that they didn't butcher themselves, and that's kind of what made it such a luxury dining experience. Everything was from scratch. He says that basically everything except the caviar and the pâté were the only things that came out of a can, and then sometimes pastries would be brought in from bakeries. Still fresh though. But everything else there was done from scratch. They made all of their sauces from scratch. They baked their bread. They used that bread to make breadcrumbs from scratch. So it was just a really luxury, top quality experience that you would get if you went to the finest New York restaurants. The only real difference was that they cooked everything slightly under. Everything was done undercooked because then the food would be transferred to the actual plane where the flight attendants would continue to cook it in an oven to bring it up to temperature so that when it was served, it wasn't overdone, but it was still hot, and it was served exactly how the chef wanted. Then these meals were served on the finest china. For British Airways, it was all made by Royal Doulton. The cutlery on Air France was particularly iconic as it was designed by Raymond Loewy, famous for his locomotive and car designs. It's said that Andy Warhol loved his cutlery so much that he would regularly steal entire sets whenever he flew on Concorde. But you don't need to steal stuff from Concorde because pretty much on every flight, they would give you a gift. These were things like Wedgwood paperweights, silver photo frames, letter openers, or one of the more popular gifts, a silver hip flask. So some of these meals, especially the lunches, would be 6 courses, and then you would have cocktails and cigars afterward. So on a 3-hour flight, you actually spend almost the entire time just eating and being served. And that's a good thing because it doesn't seem there was a lot else to do, seeing as there were no in-flight movies, there was no music playing until the 80s, and there were no screens of any kind except for one screen at the front of the cabin that told you your altitude and your speed, usually around Mach 2. So other than eating, if you wanted to entertain yourself, you had to actually talk to your fellow passengers. Can you believe it? The plane was actually kind of set up, though, to make that an easy thing to do. People would be able to get up and walk around with their cocktails, kind of just having a cocktail hour. And it helped because a lot of them knew each other. The atmosphere in the cabin was one of an exclusive club, and it was because these were the people who controlled the world's finance, and the world's trade. They were all in the Concorde Club, a club that cost $9,000 for 3 hours. Not a club that most of us are in. And if you didn't want to talk to all the other rich people, then you could, back then, go up to the cockpit. They had an open door policy, and many pilots talk about how much of the flight was spent entertaining the passengers up in the cockpit. Now this is something that I remember doing as a kid, not on Concorde obviously, but on the now defunct America West Airlines out of Phoenix. I remember getting those wings, and that was the best. They were still made of metal back then too. A time gone by. Something else that has gone by, unfortunately, is the Concorde itself, because it was the last of the supersonic transports, the ones that actually held passengers. See, by the late 90s, Concorde had lost much of its appeal. Despite several refreshes to the interior, it just couldn't compare with the newer business and first class on airplanes, especially once they introduced the lie-flat seats. It was kind of done for the Concorde because even though, yes, the flight would take 3 hours longer or sometimes 4 hours longer, you're spending that time laying down, sometimes sleeping, so yeah, do you really want to pay $9,000 to just get there a few hours earlier? Seems not. This was paired with rising maintenance costs and lower passenger numbers following a crash in Paris in July of 2000, which killed all 109 people on board plus 4 on the ground. Things got even worse after 9/11, and both Air France and British Airways decided to discontinue service. The last commercial Concorde flight was on October 24th, 2003, and on that flight from New York to London, they served quite the last breakfast. Alongside endless champagne was Scottish smoked salmon with caviar, pancetta-wrapped filet of beef and lamb cutlet with potatoes, lobster fish cakes with a Bloody Mary relish, a mushroom and truffle omelet with hash browns and grilled tomato, Greek yogurt with passion fruit and berries, then a dessert of buttermilk panna cotta and a cheese plate with Stilton cheddar and goat's cheese with fig essence. Quite the feast. I don't think everybody got everything. You kind of had to choose, maybe, but you probably could have everything if you had the time. But nonetheless, that's a lot of food. Also, I love that even in 2003, they were still serving the Scottish smoked salmon with caviar that they were serving in the 1970s, and that is what I'm about to eat right now. And here we are, a meal served on board the supersonic transport Concorde. So I'm really excited to try these things, not just because I'm excited about the food, but because I'm so excited to use some of the cutlery that I got that is actually from Concorde. Also, this is the napkin holder, napkin ring from Concorde, which I don't know, I just think it's so cool. Like these, it says British Airways, and then it has a little insignia crown on the bottom, and then of course the plates. So this, actually, I'm not eating off of, obviously. There's no food on it, but this one was for kind of hot entrees, and they're all decorated with the Concorde, as you can see, kind of in a line, which is just so clever. And then I love this tiny plate, which was meant to just hold a pat of butter. My favorite. But I'm actually going to start with the next biggest plate, holding the Scottish salmon and creme fraiche and caviar. I've only had caviar, I think, once in my entire life, and I honestly can't remember if I liked it or not. So I'm going to take apart one of these beautiful roses, because I don't want to just have like 3 ounces of salmon all in one bite. I want to savor it. But I am going to take some caviar and some creme fraiche, put that on there, make a mini canapé. Here we go. I love Scottish salmon, smoked salmon. It is so good. The creme fraiche really adds a wonderful creaminess to the texture, which is really, really nice. I don't know if I'm getting caviar. I have to try the caviar just by itself, because at $80 an ounce, you'd think that you would taste it a little bit better. I actually had a caviar spoon around here. I don't know where it went, so I'm using this one. Here we go. So it's all about the texture, because you kind of like pop in your mouth. It's good. It's I don't even want to say salty. It's more like saline. Not that that's any different, but that's the word that I want to use. I have caviar in between my teeth now. Gross. But the flavor is just very mild. I don't quite get why it's so expensive. Maybe there's really strong caviar. It's not fishy, but it's actually really good. It's the texture, though, that I like. I'm a fan. Okay, now we move on to the lobster with beurre blanc sauce. And I'm actually going to just try some of the beurre blanc, and I'm going to try it straight from the pot because I think it's a little bit hotter. So let me get this whole pot over here. Oh my God. I mean, that's ridiculous. It's just shallots and butter. So I'm not sure what else I would expect, but that's wonderful. It's like silky, creamy sauce. It's amazing, the science that turns like the butter into that texture. And it is just so flavorful with the shallots, but without any of the bite that like a normal shallot uncooked would have. I love cooked shallots or onions or whatever. Okay, now I'm going to have from the largest plate, the lobster, which is still warm, but since it's just a little bit of sauce, it's kind of cooled down. So let me just cut up. I shouldn't use a spoon, I should use a fork. Cut a little piece here. Or a big piece, and try it just without the beurre blanc. Very expensive. And now with the beurre blanc. You need the sauce. Lobster doesn't actually have a lot of flavor. I need to do a whole video on lobster. Doesn't have a lot of flavor to it. Again, it's more about the texture. and then whatever you serve with it. And usually it's something with butter. The paprika doesn't really add any flavor. It's really just there for look. So it's just plain lobster, which it needs something else, and it is that beurre blanc that it needs. So I lament the fact that I never got to fly aboard Concorde, but I am so grateful that I can taste some of the food on the actual dishes that were aboard that magnificent flying machine. And don't forget that I'm putting a link down in the description to where you can sign up for the 3 tasting history cruises that are coming up. They sell out rather quickly, so if you are interested, just jump on that, make some Concorde food, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. For decades, the epitome of luxury travel in Europe was the Orient Express, and that is in no small part due to the exquisite cuisine served aboard the train, like these lamb cutlets fried in butter with creamy Duchess potatoes. So thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring this video as we ride the Orient Express, this time on Tasting History. The Orient Express is probably the most famous train in history, though it wasn't actually just one train, but a long-distance railway service that operated numerous trains, all part of the Compagnie Internationale des Wagons-Lits, or International Sleeping Car Company. Running from Paris to Constantinople, later Istanbul, it enjoyed 2 golden ages. One was from about 1890 until World War I, and the second was between the 2 world wars. And in both periods, one of the most enticing aspects of the journey was the food being served. Now, starting in the 1890s and going up really all the way till World War II, the menus on the Orient Express and the other trains operated by the company really heavily relied on the recipes of Auguste Escoffier, at least when they were operating the trains near Paris. They included some of his iconic dishes like lobster thermidor, peach melba, jambon agélie or ham aspic, and there were dozens of different potato and lamb cutlet recipes, which is what I'm going to be making today. A plate of his côtelette d'agneau à la minute, and one of his most famous recipes, pommes de terre duchesse, or Duchess potatoes. So, to make these Duchess potatoes, Escoffier says to start off with a croquette mixture, for which you will need 2.5 pounds, or a little more than 1 kilogram of russet potatoes, 7 tablespoons, or 100 grams of butter, 2 teaspoons of salt, plus more for the water that we're going to boil the potatoes in, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, a pinch of nutmeg, and 1 whole egg plus 4 egg yolks at room temperature. So first cut the potatoes into even-sized pieces, and then add them to a pot and cover with water, then add a good amount of salt, about a tablespoon, and bring the water to a boil and let them cook for about 10 minutes until you can pierce them with a knife, though Escoffier says that they should still be quite firm at this point. Today, usually you would just boil them all the way and you're done with the cooking. But Escoffier says to first boil and then dry them out in the oven. So that's what we're going to do. So drain the potatoes and then set them on a lined baking sheet and bake at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, 205 Celsius for another 25 to 30 minutes or until they're very soft. At this point, take them out and pass them through a strainer. Now this can take quite a while, and at certain points you'll be like, nothing is happening, but I promise you, they will go through if you press them through. You can also use just like a ricer. It's going to be a lot faster, but it won't be quite as creamy. So do it the Escoffier way and press them through a strainer. Then set the pot of potatoes over low heat and add in the butter and stir it in, and then add in the 2 teaspoons of salt, 1 teaspoon of white pepper, and that large pinch of nutmeg. Stir these all in and then take it off the heat. Now touch the potatoes, and if they're warm, that's fine, but if they're quite hot, then you need to let them cool down till they are just warm, a little above room temperature, because we're going to add the eggs, and if you add them when they're too hot, they'll scramble and you'll have to start all over. But once the potatoes are just warm, add the egg yolks and the whole egg and mix everything in until it's completely smooth. Now the exciting part of these potatoes is that you can shape them in different ways, and Escoffier gives us a few options in how to shape them. He says mold into the form of a small brioche à tête, bread rolls, or flat cakes, or pipe out with a piping bag and star tube onto a buttered tray. The brioche à tête sounds kind of interesting. It would basically be like a little ball of potato with another little ball on top, but the more traditional and frankly more impressive way to do it is to pipe them. So using a star tip, pipe large mounds of potato onto a parchment-lined baking sheet. This recipe should make between 6 and 10 depending on the size of mounds you want. Also, it does help to let the potatoes come to room temperature before piping because they'll be a little firmer and hold their shape better. Also, once you've piped them, you want them to be even firmer, so put them into the refrigerator for about an hour or so. uncovered, and this will let them be firm enough so that you can brush on some melted butter without ruining all of the wonderful piping that you just did. Once you've brushed on some melted butter, set the tray in the oven, again at 400 degrees Fahrenheit, for about 25 minutes or until they are nicely browned on top. Now these potatoes, while delicious and creamy, do have a reputation for being a little dry, and that's because there isn't as much cream and butter as like a mashed potato because they need to hold their shape. So they are usually served with some sort of rather fatty meat, and for that today I am going to be making côtelettes d'agneau à la minute. Cut the cutlets very thin, season them and shallow fry in very hot clarified butter. Arrange them in a circle on a dish, sprinkle with a little lemon juice and the cooking butter after adding a pinch of chopped parsley. Serve immediately. Simple but delicious. So for this, all you'll need is some very small lamb cutlets, and you want to cut them as thin as possible, and you want to get the smallest that you can. You don't want big old lamb chops. As small as you can. Then some clarified butter for frying. You'll also need some juice from fresh lemon and minced parsley for garnish. So season the lamb with a bit of salt and pepper, and then heat the clarified butter in a wide pan, and once it hits about 350 degrees Fahrenheit, carefully set the lamb in about 3 or 4 pieces at a time. Fry them on one side for 2 or 3 minutes, and then flip them over and fry on the other side until the lamb is cooked through and reaches an internal temperature of 145 degrees. As soon as they're cooked, take them out of the butter and set them aside for 2 to 3 minutes just to rest while you transfer your Duchess potatoes onto a plate, and then plate the lamb, sprinkle with a bit of parsley, and drizzle with a bit of the lemon mixed with the butter that the lamb was fried in. That lemon butter is really the best part of this dish. Anyway, I love frying things in clarified butter, but I can't imagine doing it on a train, sloshing about as it's going down the rails. But that is exactly what the cooks on the Orient Express did. They were cooking while the train was in motion. But that's what you had to do if you wanted to provide your passengers with the freshest haute cuisine available on the rails. And that brings up the question, what exactly was it like to ride and dine on the Orient Express? The origin of the Orient Express actually begins in America, where in 1867 a Belgian civil engineer, Georges Nagelmakers, rode in one of the new Pullman train cars, which were the pinnacle of luxury, both in sleeping accommodations and in dining. He was so impressed with these Pullman train cars that he decided to go back to Europe and start a train company with cars that would rival the Pullmans. The issue was that in America, you could get on the train and ride for several days uninterrupted. But in Europe at the time, pretty much all of the train tracks and the trains were run by individual countries. So every time you crossed a border, you would have to get out of the train, go through customs, take all of your luggage off, and then usually get onto a completely different train before going another few hundred miles until you reach the next country. But Georges had a plan, and he had the contacts to make this plan happen, because he was family friends with King Leopold II of Belgium. Now, King Leopold II is in many ways one of the greatest monsters in history. He was responsible for millions, possibly like 10 million deaths in the Belgian Congo, but he was also a train enthusiast, and he was very powerful and well connected, and that is what Georges needed. So with King Leopold II's help, Georges was able to convince all of these different countries to work together to allow this one train to go freely between the countries, basically all the way across Europe. And after some false starts and a few test runs on a smaller scale, the Orient Express made its inaugural trip in October of 1883. Sort of. Because technically the Orient Express couldn't get from Paris to Constantinople at the time because there weren't train tracks for this last part. So you actually had to go from Paris to a town just south of Bucharest, and then you would take a ferry across the Danube to Bulgaria, where you would take an entirely different train to Varna on the Black Sea, and once you arrived at Varna, you had to take a steamship to Constantinople. It wasn't until August of 1888 that the train could go unimpeded all the way from Paris to the Ottoman capital. But even in those early years, The cuisine was supposedly top-notch and was definitely something to be talked about. In fact, one of the first people to ever ride on that inaugural train, who just happened to be a reporter, wrote, "In the front of the train, the dining car, with its curtains coquettishly raised, casts an extraordinary luster on the whole scene. Large gas lights illuminate a veritable banquet hall. The tables, side by side, those with 4 seats on the right, those with 2 seats on the left, in 7 rows, are set up in a most sumptuous manner. The bright white tablecloths and napkins are artistically folded by the restaurant's sommelier. The crystal clear sparkle of the glassware, filled with rubies of red wine and topaz of white. The pure crystal water decanters and the silver caps of the champagne bottles dazzle the crowd both inside and outside, a contrast to the sorrow of parting seen on their faces." And the dining car wasn't just the restaurant, but it also had a drawing room for the ladies with wonderful plush velvet chairs, and then a library/smoking room for the men that had leather armchairs and bookcases filled with books, maps, and newspapers which were swapped in and out at each country they passed through. The dining room itself, lit by gaslight chandeliers, was furnished with wall tapestries, silk drapes, and leather and velvet chairs, and there were tables of 4 and of 2 and could seat 42 passengers in all. The tables were set with fresh flowers, polished silverware, porcelain china, and baccarat crystal glasses, just like you would find in any of the fine Parisian or London hotel restaurants of the day. And because of the international nature of the train, the staff in the early years were expected to speak multiple languages. Usually it was French, German, and English, or Italian, and sometimes other languages like Turkish. In fact, in 1894, it was said that collectively the entire staff on the train could speak 50 different languages and dialects. Now, the kitchen staff on the train usually were all French, and they worked in some of the best French hotel restaurants that Paris had to offer before getting courted and working on the train. And they all worked under the chef de cuisine. And in October of 1883, someone wrote of the genius of how this chef put together the menu. See, as you crossed from country to country, from France and Austria and Bulgaria and all these other countries, the menu would change to reflect the country that you were in. So yes, you would still have some French food, obviously, but you would also have some cuisine from the location that you're at. This genius of a man has prepared us dishes of exquisite flavor, with menus varied by the countries which we pass through. Danube sterlet, fresh Romanian caviar, and Turkish pilaf, while the sommelier follows suit, pouring us the most illustrious vintages of the Moselle, the Rhine, of Hungary, and Romania. And not only was the food excellent, but according to one American traveler, it was well priced as well. Cy Warman said the food was equal to the best in any country, and the rates are reasonable. You have 3 good meals for $2.55, which in America, in the average dining car, would cost $3. Well, by golly, that is a deal. He was also really impressed with the sleeping arrangements on the train, because most trains in the US at that time were kind of done in a dormitory style, so you were sleeping right next to someone with just a little curtain between you, unless you were paying for like a suite on one of the Pullman trains. But on the Orient Express, a compartment holds 2 or 4 people, and often, with the judicious expenditure of a few francs, the voyager can secure a small compartment all to himself, and he is quite as secluded and comfortable as he would be in the stateroom of a Pullman or Wagner. Now, while we are making an Orient Express dinner, the day, of course, would have started out with an Orient Express breakfast, and this was usually different kinds of eggs and an assortment of meats and fruit and different pastries. But according to Joseph Riley, an Englishman who was traveling in 1889, he said most of the passengers just didn't really eat anything, but just drank a cup of tea or coffee or a glass of wine. And I guess they were on vacation, so why shouldn't they have wine for breakfast? And maybe they were just saving room for lunch, because lunch could be 7 to 10 courses, and it was supposedly so excellent that if you were royalty, you would get on to eat even if you didn't have anywhere to go. At Sofia, Prince Ferdinand of Bulgaria got into the train. It appeared that Prince Ferdinand's pastime was to join the train in this way, have his déjeuner on board, get out at the frontier, and return to his capital by the next train. It seems a curious mode of enjoyment, but probably Bulgaria was less lively than it has become since. Anyhow, we presently saw some apricot omelets walking about and asked for some, but were told that this was a déjeuner commandé, and we could not share it, to which deprivation we resigned ourselves. Dinner was similarly delicious, but far more fancy, because on the train, dinner was a black tie affair. Men would dress in their best, and women would put on their best gowns and jewels, and it was very, very formal. Though there was one time on the train that you should eat dinner before you actually get on the train, and that is when you are leaving Istanbul to head back to Paris, because there was no diner car when it left Istanbul. The diner car didn't actually meet up with it until it got to Bulgaria. So just in time for breakfast, so make sure to eat before you get on board. Now, the first golden age of the Orient Express came to a rather abrupt halt at the outbreak of World War I. Though one of the dining cars used by the Wagonlit company actually played a pivotal role when, on November 11, 1918, German officers signed their surrender in a dining car known as the Compiègne Wagon. Unfortunately, the Germans used that same dining car in a bit of spite in 1940 when they demanded the surrender of the French to the German army during World War II. And it was never used again because Hitler had it blown up when he realized he was going to lose the war, just so the Allies couldn't get their hands on it again. Now, between these two world wars, well, that is the second and most glorious golden age of the Orient Express. And in the 1920s, just a couple years after it came back into service, it was redesigned with steel carriages, which offered a more comfortable ride. And they'd also been designed with the modern Art Deco interiors that would come to be so iconic. And this was the train that featured in Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. Now, when she published that book, there had never been a Murder on the Orient Express. But I guess she jinxed it, because only about a year after she published it, in 1935, somebody was murdered. It was a wealthy Romanian fashion designer. She was robbed and pushed out the window and found on the side of the tracks a little while later. Now, 2 years after she published her novel, another novelist, Beverly Nichols, wrote of actual experience on the train. And while it didn't include any murder, it did include lunch. A bell tinkles in the corridor of the Orient Express. Lunch! We get up with hunger gnawing at our inside, filled with delight at the prospect of eating crisp rolls and potato mayonnaise, and veal and petit pois, and slabs of fromage de pays, washed down by white wine drunk from a tumbler, which is the only way to drink white wine. And not only does the prospect of the food allure us, but the fact that we shall be devouring it in a fantastic chariot of steel and glass, hurling through a foreign country. There must be something seriously wrong with the man who does not enjoy lunching in the train. Now, the second golden age of the train ended at the outbreak of World War II, and while it did return to service after the war, its golden age never really returned. Partly it was because of the Iron Curtain. Europe was now divided in two, and the train traveling through so many Soviet countries became a logistical nightmare when it came to travel visas. Also, there was the proliferation of air travel. So why take several days to go across Europe when you could take several hours instead? This is not to say that the luxury of the Orient Express ended, quite the opposite. In fact, it just got more and more luxurious because the train itself ended up becoming the destination. You didn't take it from Paris to Istanbul because you needed to get from Paris to Istanbul. You took it because you wanted to ride on the Orient Express. It's kind of like the difference between taking an ocean liner to get from England to New York rather than taking a cruise where you're not really going anywhere, you just want to be on a cruise ship. But the train continued to be in service between Paris and Istanbul until 1977 and still ran other routes until 2009 when it ceased operation. Though in recent years, a completely restored version of the Orient Express, which is supposed to be really luxurious, has been out on the tracks again, and you can actually ride the Orient Express. And supposedly, they even try to recreate some of the earlier dishes from the golden age of the Orient Express. Though I don't know if they make these exact Auguste Escoffier recipes that I am about to eat right now. And here we are. Lamb cutlets fried in butter with creamy Duchess potatoes. So the potatoes, you can actually just pick them up, but that's not classy, so you should cut into them. They're really, they look firmer than like a mashed potato. Let's give it a try. It's very hot. I never test the the temperature of my food before I eat it. It's a really bad habit, and it often burns my mouth. I have no patience, I guess. Quite warm. But once I got past the burning, the texture is actually really nice. They are drier than like a mashed potato, but they're also creamier at the same time. Like the texture is so soft and smooth because we pressed it through the sieve. When it comes to the flavor, they're really, really rich. Like you can really taste all of that butter in there. They're often made with cream today. It's like part cream, part butter. So that might change the texture. But these, with all the butter and the egg, they're just so rich. But it does need some of that fat from the lamb, which I'm going to try right now, especially when you drizzle on that lemon butter. Oh, so good. Here we go. That lemon butter is heavenly. They're perfectly cooked. Like I said, you want to get them nice and thin because if they're too thick, they'll start to burn on the outside before it's totally cooked all the way through. And you don't really want any char or anything like that. You want it tender all the way through. They're so flavorful. I could eat like a dozen of these because they're so small. But on the train, this would have been one of like 7 or 8 courses. So you would just want to take a couple bites and then move on to the next dish. I didn't make 7 or 8 courses, so I'll be eating all of these. They're absolutely wonderful if you like lamb, which I do. Everything about the first class experience aboard the RMS Titanic was extravagant and elegant. But perhaps nothing was more extravagant and elegant than dinner in the first class dining saloon, which culminated in this peaches in chartreuse jelly, something I'm going to make today. So thank you to Wondrium for sponsoring this video as we dine first class, this time on Tasting History. So we started our month of Titanic videos with a soup from third class, then made several entrees, a cocktail, and a palate cleanser, so now it's time for dessert. And while that first class dinner menu from the night of April 14th, 1912 had several dessert options, none seems more interesting and frankly foreign than the peaches in chartreuse jelly. But what is peaches in chartreuse jelly? Well, most modern interpretations assume that it is peaches inside of a chartreuse-flavored jelly. And this is chartreuse. It is a liqueur that was very popular at the time, dates back a long time. It actually has a wonderful history. I'll have to do a whole episode on it at some point, but it has a very, very herbal flavor. It kind of reminds me of medicine, actually. Sweet medicine. But when you go back to actual cookbooks from this era, you see that chartreuse jelly sometimes referred to the liqueur, but more often just referred to the color. Color with a few drops of sap green to make it a pale tint like green chartreuse, and flavor it with chartreuse, noyau, brandy, or other flavor. So yes, they were still using the ingredient, but not always. And the great Victorian cookbook author Isabella Beeton includes several recipes for chartreuse with bananas and chartreuse with oranges, and has a picture of chartreuse with peaches, though not a recipe and it's not in color, which is kind of annoying, but none of those recipes do include chartreuse. So this version is going to take a little bit from Agnes Marshall, a little bit from Isabella Beeton, and a little bit from Escoffier, who said, when using peaches in jelly, they should be dipped into boiling water so as to remove the skin. They are then cooked in a syrup and allowed to cool in it. Now today we wouldn't usually think of peaches in jello as a particularly fancy dessert, but it would have been the show-stopping centerpiece of any fancy dinner during the Gilded Age. On America in the Gilded Age, I came across a fact that made me wonder if the stationary bikes aboard the Titanic didn't cause somewhat of a fervor. Because only 20 years earlier, it was thought that women riding bicycles would lead to immorality. For it is not the proper thing for the ladies to ride the bicycle. They wear skirts, of course, but if we do not stop them now, they will want to be in the style with the New York women and wear bloomers. Then how would our schoolrooms look with the lady teachers parading around among the boys and girls wearing bloomers? Well, land sakes, where are my smelling salts? Now, if you want to be scandalized with more interesting facts like this, you can click the link in the description to visit wondrium.com/tastinghistory to start your free trial today. But whether you're wearing a skirt or bloomers or even trousers, what you'll need for this recipe is 16 sheets of gelatin or 4 envelopes of powdered gelatin, Now, by the time of Titanic, both types of gelatin were used, so you can use either one. They were usually either made of beef hooves or isinglass, which is made from the swim bladders of fish. So yeah, either one's gonna work, but don't think about what they are. 3 cups or 750 milliliters of water, a half cup or 50 grams of sugar, 1 cup or 250 milliliters of chartreuse, 2 to 4 peaches, and a cup of simple syrup, or if you don't have ripe peaches, then you can use canned peaches in syrup. And when it came to the Titanic, I was wondering what they had, because the Titanic was sailing in April, and peaches really aren't in season in April, but they did have plenty of canned foods on the ship, and I didn't see peaches on the manifest, though I don't have a complete manifest. But then I came across a quote from first-class passenger Mrs. Douglas, who recalled, "The food was superb: caviar, lobster, quail from Egypt, plover's eggs, and hothouse grapes and fresh peaches." So not only did they have fresh peaches, but they also had grapes. And in 1912, eating a grape was much more complicated than it is now. First of all, they had seeds. And second of all, they put them out on the table in front of you. You can't just take them. No, you would have a pair of grape scissors, specially designed for cutting a small bunch from a larger bunch that then you could put on your plate and then eat with your fingers. But there would still be rules. When eating grapes, the half-closed hand should be placed to the lips, and the stones and skins adroitly allowed to fall into the fingers and quickly placed on the side of the plate, the back of the hand concealing the maneuver from view. That really sounds like a very stressful fruit to eat. Luckily, this recipe doesn't have any grapes, it has peaches, and it's not that hard to make. So first, mix the 3 cups of water with the sugar in a large saucepan and bring to a simmer. While it heats, soak the gelatin leaves or bloom the packets in cold water, then remove the simmering water from the heat and squeeze out any excess water from the gelatin and add it to the hot water. Then mix until it dissolves. Also, make sure that you never boil the water with the gelatin in it, because boiling it will make it lose its gelatinous properties. Then mix in the chartreuse and pour it into a well-greased mold. Now, if you have a wonderful period Victorian mold like this, then use that, but if you don't, then you can use either a silicone or a metal bundt pan. Either way, you're going to set it in the refrigerator for about 1 to 3 hours. It's going to depend on the size and the width of your pan. You'd want it to be starting to set where it's kind of thick, but not too thick, because you want to be able to fit the fruit in. Now, if you're using canned peaches, you don't really have to do anything here, but if you are using fresh peaches, score a small X in the bottom, and then set it into a pot of boiling water for about 30 to 45 seconds, and then take it out and immediately put it in ice water for 10 to 15 seconds. Now, the skins should just slough off very easily, but if they're not actually ripe, it's going to be a little bit harder. You can try doing it again, but even then, you may have to peel them by hand. But frankly, if you don't have ripe peaches, like I couldn't find ripe peaches, then maybe canned peaches is just the way to go. But if they are ripe, then heat some simple syrup on the stove, slice the peaches, and coat the slices in the simple syrup. Then turn off the stove and leave them to cool. Regardless of which peach you use, once the jelly is thickened, insert the peaches into the jelly in whatever style you like, and then return it to the refrigerator for at least 8 hours. Though if you have a thick mold like this, fairly deep, it really is going to take closer to a full day to set. But that's plenty of time to like and subscribe, follow me on Twitter at TastingHistory1, and imagine yourself a first-class passenger aboard the RMS Titanic. Now, the disparity between first, second, and third-class passengers is pretty evident. What's less evident is the disparity within the first class, which is actually a lot more than it is between the other classes. See, the cost of a first-class ticket could vary wildly, the cheapest being around £30 or $3,500 today, and the most expensive around £870 or close to $100,000 today. So when we talk about first class, yes, some of those people are like first class passengers on an airplane, but then some of those people are more like people who own their own private jets. But even at the bottom of first class, your cabin is quite nice. Besides a bed, there was a horsehair sofa, dressing table, wardrobe, and a marble-topped washstand with basin. Now, while the entire ship was centrally heated, the first-class cabins included other personal electric heaters, and you had a little call button that you could call a steward in, really for anything, but you could ask them to bring a personal electric heater for your bed. When I worked on a cruise ship, we weren't even allowed to have hot plates. Times have changed. But at this low degree of first class, you were still missing something that we would consider pretty standard today, and that was your own bath or toilet. For that, you needed to upgrade to a suite. Now, at this level of wealth, it was assumed that you were traveling with help, and so you would have an adjoining room for your servants. They were also generally a little bit larger and had larger beds than the other cabins, but if you wanted real space, then you had to splurge on one of the 4 parlor suites. 2 large bedrooms, each with a walk-in dressing room, a private bathroom and lavatory, and a spacious sitting room where you could host small parties. These rooms featured plush sofas and chairs, a writing table, and a faux fireplace. 2 of them even included a private 50-foot promenade deck, just in case you couldn't even be bothered to walk near other people. On the maiden voyage, one of the suites was occupied by the chairman of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay, and the other by Mrs. Charlotte Cardezza, her son Thomas, and their 2 servants. And Mrs. Cardezza, sometimes written Cardoza, did not pack light, but rather packed like my mom going on a long weekend. She had 14 steamer trunks, 3 suitcases, 3 large crates of baggage, and a medicine chest. But most first-class passengers had people to do their unpacking for them, and so they could enjoy the amenities Titanic had to offer. You could head up to the boat deck for an open-air promenade with views to the side of the ship as well as toward the bow. Walk around to the starboard side of the boat deck and you'd find the gymnasium with state-of-the-art equipment like the electric horse, the electric camel, a rowing machine, and mechanical bicycles. For something a bit more aerobic, you could spend 2 shillings to play a game of squash on the indoor squash court, or swim a few laps in the saltwater swimming bath open to women before lunch and men afterward. This amenity was part of the Turkish bath complex, the precursor to today's spa. For 4 shillings, you could be pampered in a set of rooms designed to evoke a Turkish hammam. It evoked, in the words of the White Star Line, something of the grandeur of the mysterious East. Can't imagine seeing that on a marketing pamphlet today. You could also have a shave at the barbershop or enjoy a cigar in the first-class smoking room, as long as you're a man, that is. The ladies preferred to lax in the reading and writing room, decorated in the Georgian style with silk-upholstered settees, or else in the first-class lounge with high ceilings modeled after the Palace of Versailles, and was primarily used for playing cards, reading, and enjoying a bit of coffee and tea. But as nice as these activities were, they were merely diversions between what took up most of your time, and that was eating meals. If you were an early riser, you'd likely start eating in your room, where the steward would bring you fresh fruit, warm scones and jam, and coffee and tea. And then you would dress for second breakfast. Yes, like hobbits, at 8 a.m., the first-class passengers would be called to breakfast by the bugle player. Breakfast included omelets, baked apples, steak and mutton chops to order, vegetable stew, and different smoked fish, and a selection of carbs, which included Quaker oats. Likely enjoyed by first-class passenger Walter Donald Douglas, who was the director of the Quaker Oats Company. Now, while there were many places for the first class to eat, this version of breakfast would have been taken in the first-class dining saloon, which could seat up to 554 passengers. Its white-paneled walls stretched the entire width of the ship, and its portholes were elegantly concealed by leaded glass windows. Now, on Sunday, April 14th, breakfast had to be cleared away for the 10:30 Anglican church service led by Captain Smith himself, after which everything had to be put back for lunch at 1 p.m. Now, after lunch, yes, you could do some exercise at the gymnasium or the promenade deck, but if I had my druthers, I'd head to the trendy Café Parisien on B deck, where many of the younger passengers gathered. Though I don't think I'd be considered a younger passenger at this point, which is kind of depressing. Other options were the Palm Court or Veranda Cafe. Matching rooms on either side of the ship, they included potted palms and ivy-covered walls to mirror the dining room of London's Savoy Hotel. Now, all of these different places to eat really illustrates one of the main differences between the first and second, and especially the third class, because second and third class had their dining saloon, and that was the only place they had to eat. First class had lots of options for all of their meals, especially for dinner. And leading up to this largest meal of the day, you would head back to your cabin to dress to the nines, as they say. Men wore white tie, and first-class passenger Elmer Taylor recalled dinner gave women passengers an opportunity to get out their latest Parisian gowns, their most brilliant jewels. It was a brilliant assembly. Contentment and happiness prevailed. Once dressed, you could take the first-class elevators down, or, more conspicuously, descend the grand staircase onto D-deck and head to the reception room to gather for dinner. This was a time to listen to Wagner and Offenbach played by the 5-piece orchestra led by Wallace Hartley. And you could order a cocktail to warm up your stomach for the 10 or 11 course onslaught you were about to enjoy. Most of this meal was served by stewards carrying around silver platters, offering diners something from each dish along with an accompanying wine. They would start with oysters and hors d'oeuvres, then a choice of consommé Olga or cream of barley soup, before moving on to poached salmon with mousseline sauce, then filet mignon and chicken lyonnaise, then lamb, roast duckling, and sirloin of beef with chateau potatoes. A course of punch romaine to cleanse the palate before enjoying roast squab, asparagus, and pâté foie gras, and then a dessert of French ice cream, Waldorf pudding, eclairs, or of course some peaches in chartreuse jelly. Then there would be a course of nuts, cheese, and coffee before the men headed off to enjoy a cigar and brandy in the smoke room. Some of the ladies would withdraw to the reading room, but in practice it seems that most of the ladies stayed at the table to chat in the saloon. Though according to some sources, many of the Titanic's most elite enjoyed that final meal in the a la carte restaurant, sometimes nicknamed the Ritz Restaurant. And I discussed it in detail in the last episode, but this is where Mrs. Walter Douglas ate her fresh peaches and grapes that last night on the ship. We dined the last night in the Ritz Restaurant. It was the last word in luxury. The tables were gay with pink roses and white daisies, the women in their beautiful shimmering gowns of satin and silk, the men immaculate and well-groomed, the stringed orchestra playing music from Puccini and Tchaikovsky. This may have also been where Lady Duff Gordon and Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon ate as well. Lady Duff Gordon was a wealthy fashionista of the time, and she gives one of the most complete first-hand accounts of the events aboard Titanic. And it's perfect to share for this episode because it is just so first class, and I don't necessarily mean that as a compliment. She begins the narrative of that night by reassuring readers that I have never been a psychic woman, and in all my life have never been to a seance or dabbled in the occult. But something warned me, some deep instinct, that all was not well. But despite her misgivings, she dresses and goes down to dinner. I remember that last meal on Titanic very well. We had a big vase of beautiful daffodils on the table, which were as fresh as if they had just been picked. Everybody was very gay, and at neighboring tables, people were making bets on the probable time of this record-breaking run. She talks of the multi-millionaires, the Wideners and Thayers, laughing as they dined with Captain Smith, and at another table was the wealthiest man on board, John Jacob Astor IV, and his bride. And they were the subject of quite a bit of gossip. See, Astor was 46 and recently divorced when he married Madeline, his new bride of 18. El scandalo. But the fervor must have subsided because they were dining with former congressman and owner of Macy's department store Isidore Straus and his wife. Lady Duff Gordon says that these two so openly adored one another. They told us laughingly that in their long years of married life they had never been separated for one day or night. Their bodies were found afterwards clasped in one another's arms. After dinner, Lady Duff Gordon returned to her cabin on A deck and chatted with her secretary, Miss Francatelli, as they warmed themselves by the electric heater. Then she undressed and went to bed. But she hadn't been asleep for very long when she was awakened by a low rumbling noise, and then she heard voices out in the hall, one that said that they had struck an iceberg. So she got up and went out into the hall, where an officer told her that it was nothing and that she should go back to bed. It was also around this time that Margaret Brown, later known as the unsinkable Molly Brown, also came out of her cabin. On emerging from my stateroom, I found many men in the gangway in their pajamas. They, while standing, were chaffing each other. One of them remarked, "Are you prepared to swim in those things?" referring to the pajamas. Women were standing along the corridors in their kimonos. All seemed to be quietly listening, thinking nothing serious had occurred. By the way, in the Broadway musical Titanic, there's this wonderful song called Dressed in Your Pajamas in the Grand Salon, and it really talks about this whole scene of just everyone kind of standing around in their pajamas, not thinking that anything was wrong. But in reality, Lady Duff Gordon remembered her feeling of uneasiness and decided to wake her husband Cosmo and tell him to go investigate further. But 10 minutes later, he returned and told his wife that she had better put on her warmest clothes. At the same time, Miss Francatelli, her secretary, who was staying further below decks, came up and said that there was water in her room and that they better put on their life belts. A steward came to help them. We followed him out of the cabin. Before the door closed, I looked round it for one last time. I shall never forget that glimpse of the lovely little room with its beautiful lace quilt and pink cushion. It all looked so homely and pretty that it did not seem possible there could be any danger. At that moment, a vase of flowers on the washstand slid off suddenly, and fell with a crash to the floor. When they got up on deck, the lifeboats were already being loaded, and she comments rather snidely about the willingness of the American women to enter the lifeboats without their husbands, saying that they have brought the cult of chivalry to such a pitch in the States that it comes as second nature to their men to sacrifice themselves and to the women to let them do it. She did indeed refuse to get into a lifeboat without her husband, but there was a smaller lifeboat, Lifeboat 1, that was only capable of holding about 40 people, and there was nobody else around, so she, her husband, and Miss Francatelli all got in. It lowered with only 12 people, 5 passengers and 7 crew members. It really was the closest thing you could get to a first-class experience on a lifeboat, and Lady Duff Gordon refused to look at the boat as she was sinking until her husband said, "My God, she is going now." She finally looked up and says that she could hear the clamor of everything that hadn't been bolted to the decks sliding down into the water. I think that it was only at that moment that many of those poor souls on board realized their fate. For a few seconds, Titanic stayed motionless, while agonized cries from her decks grew in intensity, and then, with one downward rush, she plunged to her grave, and the air was rent with those awful shrieks. Then silence. Now what happened next is up for some debate. What definitely did not happen was they did not go back to try to rescue anyone. But the rumor spread that Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon had actually paid the crew members on the lifeboat to not go back and rescue anyone, and the newspapers dubbed it the Money Boat. But this probably didn't actually happen. What likely happened is they were justly worried about the boat being swamped, and the rumor came from a later exchange between Sir Cosmo and one of the crew members. See, after the ship went down, Lady Duff Gordon looked at Miss Francatelli and made a feeble joke. "Just fancy that. There is your beautiful nightdress, gone." Well, that gallows humor was not appreciated by the crew members in the boat, one of whom said, "You people need not bother about losing your things, for you can afford to buy new ones when you get ashore. What about us poor fellows?" To which Sir Cosmo said, "Yes, that's hard luck if you like, but don't worry, you'll get another ship. At any rate, I'll give you a $5 each toward getting a new kit." And that's what I meant by her narrative just being so first class. And whether it was their wealth or position in society, or merely their position on the ship being closer to the lifeboats, the first class fared far better than anyone else on the ship. About 60% of them survived. And some of those survivors carried their menus with them in their coat pockets, so that today we can get a glimpse into those last happy moments aboard Titanic where they enjoyed food such as peaches in chartreuse jelly. So once your jelly is fully set, dip the mold into some hot water for just a few seconds, then set an oiled plate over the top and flip it over. It should just plop out. If it doesn't, return it to the hot water and try again. Then you can garnish it with a bit of whipped cream or Italian meringue, or just leave it as is. And here we are, peaches in chartreuse jelly from the last meal aboard the Titanic. Got some peach, got some meringue, and got some jelly, which is so jiggly. Here we go. That texture. I don't like jelly, like Jell-O. So that's the first thing. I don't like the texture. But I kind of knew that going in. What's interesting is that at first I was like, oh, this flavor, I don't want my dessert to taste like the 150 herbs that are used in chartreuse. But then there's enough sugar in there. And the peach, it kind of like coats that weird medicinal flavor. But you get the medicinal flavor at first, but then it goes away for a bit more of a subtle sweetness. Do I like it? No, I don't. But I don't hate it as much as I thought I would, so that's good. Honestly, this dish is a centerpiece, you know, but that's really all that it is, in my opinion, because I don't like jelly. So that, don't let that influence if you want to make it. It's kind of fun to make, especially if you have a really cool mold. So as we wind down Titanic month, I just wanted to thank you all. These videos have done very well, and I was worried that an entire month of Titanic was going to be too much for people, but it wasn't. People really, really loved it, and lots of new subscribers. I hope you stick with me for future episodes, not on Titanic, because we do other interesting things here on the channel. Also, I finally finished my Titanic Lego, except that I am missing a flag that I'm pretty sure that the cat ate. Anyway, make sure to follow me on Twitter and Instagram. I'll put all the links to my socials and Patreon down in the description, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. Ever since I was a little kid, I have been enamored with the concept of afternoon tea. A meal between meals is right up my alley. Also, I think I probably thought that it was going to be a lot more like the Mad Tea Party from Alice in Wonderland. It's not, but it does come with cake. Like these Victoria sandwiches from 1861, made with sugar, butter, jam, and mustard.
Mustard?
Okay, no mustard.
Don't let's be silly.
So thank you to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video as we enjoy a bit of tea and cake, this time on Tasting History. There are so many foods that can be present during a traditional afternoon tea. Crumpets, petit fours, cucumber sandwiches, and scones, though it seems that their association with afternoon tea didn't come along until relatively late, around the early 20th century. But the mother, or perhaps queen, of all tea-time treats has to be the Victoria sandwich, enjoyed by and named after Queen Victoria herself, who ate them at her outdoor afternoon teas. The recipe for which was immortalized in Isabella Beeton's 1861 Book of Household Management as Victoria sandwiches. Ingredients: 4 eggs, their weight in pounded sugar, butter, and flour, a 1/4 saltspoon of salt, a layer of any kind of jam or marmalade. Mode: beat the butter to a cream, dredge in the flour and pounded sugar. Stir these ingredients well together and add the eggs, which should have been previously thoroughly whisked. When the mixture has been well beaten for about 10 minutes, butter a Yorkshire pudding tin, pour in the batter, and bake it in a moderate oven for 20 minutes. Let it cool. Spread 1/2 of the cake with a layer of nice preserve, place over it the other half of the cake. Press the pieces slightly together, and then cut it into long finger pieces. Pile them in crossbars on a glass dish and serve. So this original recipe has some clear differences from its modern counterpart. First, there is no whipped cream, and that wasn't actually added until well into the 20th century. Also, no chemical leavener, even though when the recipe was written, baking powder was quite popular throughout England. In later editions, they do add some baking powder, but even then, it's not all that much. But in this original recipe, they depend entirely on the air trapped in the whisking of the butter and the eggs. And that can make a cake rise, but not nearly as much as chemical leavener is going to do. And she has you add the flour early on in the recipe and then mix it quite a lot. So it's going to work in a lot of gluten, which is going to make for a very chewy cake, something you don't usually want. But again, in subsequent versions, she, or the people who were writing the book at that point, change it and add the flour at the very end and then add some baking powder. So if you want to add a couple teaspoons of baking powder, flour at the end, go right ahead. But I want to see what this very first recipe tasted like, so I'm going to follow her rules as closely as I can. So while you don't have to do a lot of measuring with HelloFresh, if you're following this recipe from 1861 for Victoria sandwiches, you do need to do some measuring. So for this recipe, what you'll need is 4 eggs, 1 cup plus 2 tablespoons or 225 grams of castor sugar, 2 sticks or 225 grams of softened butter, a little less than 2 cups or 225 grams of flour, and a pinch of salt. Also, it's important that all of those ingredients are room temperature or else you're going to have trouble getting them to combine. You'll also need some jam, and you can buy jam. She actually says buying jam is less work and you should just do that, but she also has recipes for jam, so if you want to make your own strawberry jam, then what you'll need is 1 pound or 450 grams fresh hulled strawberries, 1.5 cups or 300 grams of jam sugar. So jam sugar has some pectin added in, and that's what she uses for her jam, and you can make jam without it, but it's going to be a lot looser. Delicious, but looser, and it's not going to be great for making this. You want a nice firm jam. And 2 tablespoons of fresh lemon juice. So making the jam is very easy, but you really do want to make it the day before because it does take a while to set. So first, chop up the berries into small pieces, then add them into a medium bowl with the sugar and the lemon juice, and set the pot over medium heat and mix the ingredients together. Continue to stir until the sugar is fully melted, then raise the heat a little bit and bring it to a boil, mashing the berries as they soften. Let it continue to simmer for another 10 to 15 minutes or until the jam reaches 220 degrees Fahrenheit or 105 Celsius. And make sure the entire time that you're stirring the jam every minute or so just to make sure nothing is scorching. As soon as it hits 220 degrees, remove it from the heat and continue to stir for just a minute. Then pour it into a jar, or as we'll be using pretty much the whole thing to make the cake, you can just put it into a bowl. Then let it cool completely, preferably overnight in the fridge, and the next day you can start working on your cake. So first, beat the butter until it's nice and fluffy, then add the sugar and cream them together. Then whisk the salt into the flour, and if you're adding baking powder, add it here as well. Then stir the flour into the butter until somewhat incorporated. In a separate bowl, whisk the eggs until they're nice and frothy, then mix them with the butter and flour mixture. And you need to make sure it's completely mixed, and in subsequent recipes, she says to add a little bit of milk until you have a nice pourable batter. Then pour the batter into a buttered or parchment-lined rectangular tin. And it's a little confusing here because she says to put it into a Yorkshire pudding tin, which if you look that up today, looks like this. But in the 1800s, and sometimes still today, Yorkshire puddings were made in large rectangular tins. Then smooth the top of the cake and set it in the oven on the middle rack at 350 degrees or 175 Celsius for 15 to 20 minutes or until a toothpick inserted comes out clean. Then take it out of the oven, let it cool in the pan for about 10 minutes, and then remove it and let it cool completely. Now, as this cake is traditionally enjoyed with a cup of tea, I wanted to do something on the history of tea. But it is a huge, vast history, and it can actually be quite dark and political at times, so I think it's going to need to be a whole series of videos in the future. And since our cake, I think without the baking powder, might be a little dense today, I figured I would keep the history on the lighter side. Now, nobody knows exactly when tea got to England. It was probably in the 1650s. But it was in 1662 that it gained some notoriety as a large chest of dried tea leaves was part of Catherine of Braganza's dowry. She was the daughter of King John IV of Portugal and married Charles II, restored King of England and lover of little dogs named after him. As a favorite drink of the new queen, it very quickly became the official drink at court and was enjoyed by the super wealthy because it was really expensive. Coming all the way from China, tea not only cost a great deal of money, but it came with stories of elaborate tea ceremonies in China and Japan. And the Europeans longed to experience just a little bit of that ceremony, though the Europeans very quickly made it their own when they started adding milk to it, partly to cool it down according to early writings, and it was also done for its health benefits, as one medical declaration from the 1660s claimed, "Tea, being prepared and drank with milk and water, strengtheneth the inward parts, and prevents consumption, and powerfully assuages the pains of the bowels, or griping of the guts, or looseness." A time before Pepto-Bismol. The problem was, very few people could still enjoy it because it was still very expensive. And not long after, in the early 18th century, it was gaining the reputation as being a drink for ladies. Not because it was particularly feminine, but because the more popular at that time coffee was, at least publicly, a man's drink, as London's coffee houses didn't admit women patrons. But in 1717, one of the proprietors of those coffee houses, Thomas Twining, expanded to include tea along with the coffee. He'd been selling the beverage since 1706, but in this shop, the Golden Lion, it catered to both men and women. Great ladies flocked to Twining's house in Devereux Court in order to sip the enlivening beverage in small cups, for which they paid their shillings. Throughout the 18th century, the price of tea dropped dramatically so everyone could enjoy it, and it really did become a meal all of its own. And a meal of tea and meat dishes, known then as high tea, or sometimes the more on-the-nose meat tea, became very popular with the middle and lower classes, though the meal actually replaced the evening meal instead of just adding a fourth meal to the day. Also, to clear up some confusion, at least here in the US, many times when we say high tea, we mean something very fancy because I guess the word high is in it, and it seems like high and almighty or whatever. but actually high tea was the more common tea, and it was called high tea partly because it was eaten at a high table, a dinner table, rather than low tea or afternoon tea, which was eaten at a low table or like a coffee table today. But these different combinations of tea and food being served together were not necessarily a daily occurrence for most people, and it wasn't until the 1840s that afternoon tea became an established custom. And credit for this change is often given to Anna Russell, the 7th Duchess of Bedford. At that time, the daily agenda for your average unbelievably wealthy person in England was a large breakfast, and then a smaller, less formal lunch, and then dinner at 8 p.m. with nothing to nosh on in between those two meals. I'm a snacker, so I couldn't do it, and it seems that the Duchess couldn't either. For between 4 and 5 o'clock, she would complain of a sinking feeling and indulge in a pot of tea and some bread or cakes, the recognized establishment of the daily afternoon tea. Now later, the practice of afternoon tea would become an established custom for many people, but in those early days, it seemed that afternoon tea had to be taken rather covertly. One of the early guests of these afternoon teas was the actress Fanny Kemble, and she wrote in 1842, "When visiting Belvoir Castle, I received on several occasions private and rather mysterious invitations to the Duchess of Bedford's room, and found her with a small and select circle of female guests of the castle, busily employed in brewing and drinking tea with her Grace's own private tea kettle." And she said that those first afternoon teas were a very private and, I think, rather shamefaced practice of it. But it didn't stay shamefaced for long, because the Duchess Anna Russell was good friends with Queen Victoria. And so when the Duchess did something, it was cool simply because the Duchess did it. She was the Regina George of 19th century England. And when I say that she was Regina George, I mean it, because the Duchess was a mean girl. See, there's a story about another lady at court, Lady Flora Hastings. And Lady Flora was highly educated and notorious for her stinging wit, something that the other ladies at court didn't seem to enjoy very much. Well, in 1839, she caused a little bit of a scandal when she rode in a carriage unaccompanied from Scotland to London with Sir John Conroy. Tongues began to wag. And just a few months later, Flora went to go see the Queen's own physician with a complaint of nausea and swelling in her lower abdomen. And without doing a full examination, he did declare that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't married. Of course, she denied it, but it was too late. The rumor mill was in full swing, headed by Baroness Louise Lezen and the Duchess Anna Russell. The rumor eventually reached Queen Victoria, who, by all accounts in those early days of her reign, was kind of a mean girl herself, and she treated Lady Flora very poorly and very publicly. It was actually something that later on in life, Queen Victoria would say that she greatly regretted. So to defend her honor, Lady Flora was forced to publish a letter in the Examiner newspaper. But her belly continued to grow, and her reputation was beyond repair at that point. And a few months later, she died. And they did an autopsy only to find the cause to be a large tumor on her liver. Well, now, the Queen obviously did have some remorse later on, but as far as I could find, there was no remorse on the side of either Baroness Lezen or Duchess Russell. Mean girls, like I said. But they did give England afternoon tea, and by the 1870s it had become de rigueur for fashionable ladies of London to host their own afternoon teas where they would invite people over. And while it was no longer a shamefaced practice, as it was at the beginning, it was still done with a bit of secrecy, often not having any servants present, so the ladies and sometimes gentlemen could speak freely. Now, the establishment of the afternoon tea even inspired a new type of garment, the tea gown. Everyone knows that a tea gown is a hybrid between a wrapper and a ball dress. It is always a train and usually long flowing sleeves, is made of rather gorgeous materials, and goes on easily. It can very properly be put on for tea, and if one is dining at home, kept on for dinner. so it was less formal than other dresses and could be put on without the help of a maid. But perhaps the most important thing was that as its use usually enables ladies to dispense with the corset, the hygienic value of the tea gown is apparent. The wearing of it is a fashion which, it may be hoped for the sake of those who follow it, may be more than just a passing fancy. And it was more than just a passing fancy, as tea gowns were worn from the 1870s all the way through the early 1930s. And during that period, afternoon tea evolved and became very popular with men and women alike. In fact, one of the most eloquent praises of afternoon tea comes from just such a gentleman, the author George Gissing. Nowhere is the English prodigy of domesticity more notably evidenced than in the festival of afternoon tea. One of the shining moments of my days is that when, having returned a little weary from an outdoor walk, I exchange boots for slippers, out-of-doors coat for easy, familiar, shabby jacket, and in my deep, soft-elbowed chair await the tea tray. Alas, I have no tea tray, nor a servant to bring it to me, nor a tea gown to wear for the occasion, so I'm going to have to be a little more casual in my enjoying tea and cake. But first, I have to actually finish the cake. So once it is completely cooled, slice the cake into little finger sandwiches. Now she says to cut the cake in half and then put on the jam and then cut it into fingers, and I'll tell you right now, it makes a bit of a mess, so it's just better to do it this way. Slice each of the fingers in half, then spread the cooled jam on one half and place the other half on top. And she doesn't mention it here, but in later editions she does sprinkle on a bit of powdered sugar. And here we are, Victoria sandwiches. So with the cake, you're probably going to want a cup of tea. Now, Earl Grey is my usual go-to, and Darjeeling was the favorite of that mean girl Duchess. But today, I'm going to try a tea that was actually sent to me by Matt Bage, who was the person who designed the opening intro for Tasting History. Matt and his sister Kendra run Cosplay Cafe, and they sent me 3 blends which you can actually get online. Fire, grass, and water type, and since I always choose Squirtle, I'm going to try the water type. The herbs and flowers in the tea actually color the drink, so it's a lot of fun to drink. A perfect accompaniment to the sandwiches. Let's give it a go. So it's definitely denser than a modern Victoria sponge. I mean, there is no chemical leavener, and then adding the flour in that early on in the recipe is just crazy. But it is not as dense as I would have thought. There's actually a really nice crumb to it, and the flavor is fantastic. It's sweet, and it's interesting because it almost has like a vanilla quality, but there is no vanilla in it. The jam is fantastic. It is really, really sweet, but it still maintains so much strawberry flavor. I mean, I definitely suggest making it yourself if you can find good berries, which is not always easy. So would I make this again? Not this recipe, because the modern recipe is just better. We've just come so far in cake making. So go look at Mary Berry's recipe or any of those on the BBC website. They're all fantastic. And it's just going to be a little bit more to most people's taste. But this is also really, really good. So make sure to follow me on Instagram, Tasting History with Max Miller, and I'll put a link in the description to where you can go check out Cosplay Cafe and see about their teas, and I will see you next time on Tasting History. The sinking of the ocean liner RMS Lusitania by a German U-boat during World War I was an event that shocked the world. And today we are going to look at the events around the sinking, as well as take a look at what it was like to actually ride on the great ship, as I make this Victoria pudding featured on one of the ship's second-class menus. So thank you to NordVPN for sponsoring this video as we dine on the Lusitania, this time on Tasting History. So most people know the Lusitania for being the target of a German torpedo on May 7th, 1915. And in school, we were taught that it was one of the leading causes that brought America into World War I, though the fact that we didn't get into the war for 2 more years turns out, yeah, it was there, but it's not really one of the leading causes. There was a lot more. It's very, very complicated, and that's not what this episode is about. But regardless, before she became famous for sinking, the Lusitania was renowned for her luxury and her speed, 2 of the most important things that you want in an ocean liner, especially at the start of the 20th century. Now, unfortunately, I was unable to actually find a menu from the last meal on the Lusitania, which would have been lunch on May 7th, 1915, just a couple hours before she sank. But because the ship, which launched in 1907, was in operation for the better part of 8 years, there are numerous menus that exist from those years, mostly from the first and second class. So when choosing a dish to make, I had so many options, but eventually decided on Victoria pudding, which was served to the second class on Thursday, October 9th, 1913. What's interesting is that this same exact dish was served to the first class passengers aboard the RMS Titanic on April 11th, 1912. The thing is, throughout history, there are several dishes that go by the name Victoria pudding, and they're all quite different, so I'm not entirely sure which one this was, but since it was meant to be a dish to impress, I am going to guess that it's the recipe that can be found in the 1894 cookbook Fancy Ices by Mrs. Agnes B. Marshall. Now, the recipe is quite long, so I'm not going to read the entire thing right now, but I will put the full thing up on tastinghistory.com, my website. But for now, here are just some highlights. Take 1 pint of vanilla custard. Add to it the puree of 6 large or 8 small raw ripe bananas that have been pounded with 1 ounce of castor sugar, the pulp of 2 oranges and 1 lemon, and a 1/4 pound of raw ripe or cooked pineapple. Mix these together and color with a little of Marshall's apricot yellow and rub through a fine hair sieve. Flavor with a wineglassful of orange flower water, a teaspoonful of vanilla essence, and a wineglassful of brandy. This is then made into an ice cream that's kind of mixed with some whipped cream, and then it's put into a mold and frozen into a pretty shape, and then you make banana compote and put that all around it. The thing is, to start the recipe, you need that vanilla custard, and she does not give you a recipe for vanilla custard in this book. She says that you have to go to her previous book to find that recipe, so you essentially have to buy 2 cookbooks to do this recipe. And some might say that that's a scam, and others might say it's just a shrewd business practice. I would say that's a scam, and I promise in my next cookbook you will not have to buy the first cookbook to make any of the recipes. They will be standalone. Luckily for me, I do have Agnes Marshall's first cookbook, so this is what you need to make her vanilla custard. 2 cups or 475 milliliters of heavy cream, a heaping 1/2 cup or 110 grams of sugar, 7 medium or 6 large egg yolks, a pinch of salt, and 1 teaspoon of vanilla. So first, sprinkle the salt over the egg yolks and then add the sugar and whisk until they are a nice pale yellow. Then add in the vanilla and whisk that in, and then heat the cream until just simmering, take it off the heat, and then we're going to add it to the eggs. But you can't just pour the whole thing into the eggs or you'll have scrambled eggs, so we need to temper them by taking 1 ladle at a time of the hot cream and adding it to the egg yolks, whisking it in, and only then adding another ladle. After 3 or 4 ladles worth, you can then add the rest of the cream and whisk until smooth. Then you can either set this in the fridge, or even faster, you would take the bowl and put it into another bowl that has an ice bath in it, and it should cool down the whole custard in about 10 minutes. And during that time, you can gather the rest of your ingredients, which are 6 bananas, 3 tablespoons of sugar, 2 small oranges, 1 small lemon, 3 round slices or 110 grams of pineapple, 2 teaspoons of orange flower water, 1 teaspoon of vanilla, and 2 tablespoons of brandy. You'll also need some yellow food coloring, and Agnes Marshall specifically says you should use Marshall's apricot yellow, and were this 120 years ago, you could just flip to the back of the cookbook where you could order it along with any number of other dyes, ice cream makers, and the many molds that she sold. As I said, she was a very shrewd businesswoman, like 1/3 of the cookbook is just advertisements. Unfortunately, the business is no longer around, so just use regular food coloring. So mash the bananas as smooth as possible, then mix it with the sugar, then blend the peeled lemon and orange along with the pineapple and add the pulp to the bananas. Then mix everything together. And you want to get this as smooth as possible, so if you have an immersion blender, use that. Otherwise, just mash until it's really smooth. By now your custard should also be cool, so you can stir that into the mixed fruit, and this is followed by the yellow food coloring. Now she doesn't say how much exactly to use, but the idea is to mimic the color of the outside of a banana, so you want to add a fair amount of the food coloring in, especially because once we add the whipped cream, it will lighten it up a little bit. I think it took me about 4 or 5 drops. Then pass this mixture through a sieve. This is why you want it nice and smooth, because if you don't get it smooth, then a lot of the pulp will end up staying in the sieve, which some of it will, but the more you can kind of press through, the better. Then to that you can add the orange flower water, the vanilla, and the brandy, and stir those in, and then it is time to freeze. And unfortunately, she doesn't say how long to freeze it, but it kind of doesn't matter because her ice cream maker would have been different than a modern ice cream maker, though they actually work on pretty much the same exact idea. Today, it's going to take about 15 to 20 minutes. You want to get something about as thick as soft serve. So add the mixture to the ice cream maker, and while it's freezing, take a half cup or 120 milliliters of heavy cream and 1 tablespoon of sugar and whisk it into a stiff whipped cream. Then about 10 minutes into the freezing, add the whipped cream to the partially frozen ice cream and continue to freeze until it's done. Once it's nice and thick, then you can pour the ice cream into a mold, and you want some fancy mold because that's kind of the whole point of the dessert, and it does help if you put a little bit of water in the mold, rinse it, and then throw it out right before you add the ice cream. It makes it easier to get out later on. Then take the mold, put it into the freezer, and let it freeze until it is as frozen as you can get. Really, it should be like a day. Now, just because I know that change is hard, it's going to be hard on me, it's going to be hard on you, I wanted to give you a heads up that while this is not the last video that you'll see of me in this kitchen, it is close to the last because we are going to be doing some remodeling, light changes, mainly just kind of different cabinet color and everything. So while that's happening, I'm gonna be filming in a totally different location, and I don't know where that is yet. Maybe I'll go to my parents', maybe I'll just be working in a half-empty kitchen with a hot plate. Not sure, but just giving you a heads up. Now, while our Victoria pudding freezes, let us take a look at what it was like to eat and sail on the Lusitania. So what was it like to dine aboard the RMS Lusitania? Well, it's really going to depend on what class you're in. If you are in third class, then you would eat in the third class dining saloon on D deck, near the bow of the ship, a spot where you would feel the most movement of the ship. The room featured long tables with polished pine-paneled walls and wooden swivel chairs bolted to the deck. And because Lusitania was known for her luxury, even the third-class passengers ate better than second-class passengers on much smaller ships. And so they would have things like roast mutton and blue marrow-fat peas and lots of different fruit, rarely fresh fruit. It was mostly canned fruit like pineapple and peaches, but overall, they ate pretty well. And if while you were dining you wanted some entertainment, they provided a piano in the dining saloon, though they didn't provide a player, so you had to hope that somebody in your class was proficient at piano. Now, the third-class dining saloon was not actually large enough to accommodate all of the third-class passengers at one time. It was by far the largest class on the ship, and so they would break up each meal into 2 seatings, which is actually standard on many cruise ships today, and that was the same thing that they had to do in the second-class dining saloon. This saloon had a similar setup of long tables with fixed swivel chairs, though these chairs seemed to be far better padded, and it was decorated with white paneled walls and white pillars, and while the main saloon was on D deck, there was seating in the balcony 1 deck up, which was used only when the ship was booked to capacity, which was the case on Lusitania's final voyage, because there were 40 additional passengers that at the last minute were put onto Lusitania along with 5 additional crew members because another ship, the Cameronia, had just been requisitioned by the British Admiralty. Though many of these passengers were probably glad to be transported to Lusitania because she had a reputation for luxury and for speed, keeping her safe from U-boats. This is what we call foreshadowing. Anyway, the menus of the second class on Lusitania are really quite impressive. For instance, luncheon on the 1st of May 1915, only a week before she sank, included everything from pottage Albion, which is a giblet soup, to fricassee of calves' feet, roast beef, brown potatoes, carrots Vichy. There were cold meats like ox tongue and galantine of veal, an aspic-covered forcemeat that has lost popularity but was all the rage in 1915. Dessert included plum tarts, pastry, rice pudding, and ice cream, followed by cheese, fruit, nuts, and tea and coffee. And that was just lunch. Once you got to dinner, at least in 1913, you were going to get 11 courses, starting off with radishes, then a vegetable soup called potage Georgette, boiled salmon, chicken or lamb, roast beef with Yorkshire pudding, an assortment of vegetables, roast duckling with applesauce, then desserts including the Victoria pudding that we're making today, then ice cream, cheese, tea, and coffee. Now, should you be fortunate enough to find yourself dining in first class, which was rather expensive, well then you would be dining in one of the grandest dining saloons afloat. Like the others, it was on D-deck, but it was at the center of the ship where the motion of the ship was felt the least. And with 470 seats, it typically fit all of the first-class passengers who wished to dine. The tables were split on 2 levels under a great dome decorated with frescoes of cherubs. The room was decorated with white plaster, mahogany panels, and gold leaf, and was dotted with Corinthian columns with gilded capitals. But the room was not without its faults. There were often complaints that the food would arrive cold because of the distance that the servers had to travel from the kitchen to the dining room. I guess they fixed that at some point, but at least at first, food would often be cold. Another issue was that if you were sitting in that balcony, then instead of having portholes that looked out to the ocean, you looked out upon a promenade of third-class passengers who were known to gawk at the finer first-class passengers dining in the saloon. But I assure you, the ogles of the riffraff would soon be forgotten once the food comes. For breakfast, you could have basically anything you wanted, from fruit, porridge, grape nuts, smoked salmon, a half-dozen type of eggs and omelets, vegetable stew, Wiltshire bacon, fried bananas and potatoes, and then cold meats, every bread and pancake you could possibly imagine, and then tea, coffee, or cocoa. Now this was typically served around 8 or 8:30 a.m., and just a few hours later, at 12:30, you would have lunch, which has so many different dishes, I can't possibly even name like half of them, but it's insane. There were multiple hors d'oeuvres, 3 different soups, egg dishes, fish dishes, savory pies, and meats like roast beef and boiled calf's head. Then any number of other meats ordered straight from the grill like mutton chops or filet mignon. There were cold seafood dishes like lobster mayonnaise, and then cold quail, capon, and boar's head. Numerous vegetable dishes, and then desserts of Nesselrode pudding, which is a dessert of sweet chestnuts, and Macédoine of fruits, which is fruit suspended in the fanciest of gelatin molds. Then you would finish with strawberry and peach ice cream, different cheeses, fruits, nuts, and coffee. I guess they didn't have cocoa at lunch, it was just a breakfast thing, which kind of sucks. Anyway, that's lunch. Then you would have an afternoon tea, smaller, but still an afternoon tea, and then around 8 or 8:30, you would have dinner. And this would be just like lunch, but even grander, even more dishes, fancier dishes. I can't believe how much these people ate. Now, of course, they weren't eating every dish. You would just eat little pieces here and there, and it was just usually a bite or 2 of everything. But still, it was a lot of food, and it took a lot of time to do this. And I don't know about you, but when I was a kid, I couldn't really sit through an hours-long dinner. I know kids in the early 20th century are probably super well-behaved, but they didn't sit through these hour-long dinners either, because should you bring children aboard with you, they didn't come to the meals. They were sat with a stewardess who would feed and entertain them and keep them away from the adults. And these stewardesses had a lot on their plate, so to speak, because during that last voyage, a single stewardess was saddled with 22 children at one point. Now, after your childless dinner, it was time to smoke and drink, something that you would have done before the meal and between most meals, and probably several times a day, especially the smoking. They smoked a lot. I can just imagine that everything on that ship and kind of in the world just reeked of smoke. But luckily, the ship was prepared for this. On that last voyage, they had 30,000 Three Castles cigarettes, 10,000 Manila cigars, and 760 pounds of different pipe tobacco. And this was, of course, in addition to all of the tobacco products that the passengers themselves brought on. For drinking, the ship stocked 150 cases of black and white whiskey, 50 cases of Canadian Club whiskey, 50 cases of Plymouth gin, 30 cases of wine, 12 barrels of stout, and 10 of ale. Now, if you were in first class, you would enjoy music while you dined, provided by the string quintet aboard. And should you be very fortunate, you might be invited to actually sit at the captain's table. Now, on most Cunard ships of the day, the captain was not only responsible for keeping the ship going and getting to where it needed to go on time, but also for entertaining some of the passengers. See, in the days before cruise directors, it was up to the captain to kind of walk around the ship and schmooze with some of the more elite passengers. He would also be in charge of giving the Sunday service, the church service. And he would have a captain's table where he was expected to sit and dine with the most important passengers on the boat. Now this was something William Turner, who was captain of the Lusitania on her final voyage, was not a fan of. Nor was he very good at it. In fact, his housekeeper, who then turned into his life partner, once said that Captain Turner described the passengers as a load of bloody monkeys who are constantly chattering. So he actually preferred to eat in his cabin and just kind of skip the whole captain's table routine, though sometimes he couldn't when he was working on other Cunard ships, and he was captain of many of their ships, including the Carpathia, which was under a different captain, the ship that rescued the Titanic survivors, and I'm going to do a video on that experience. But when he took over Lusitania, he didn't have to do any of this stuff because the ship was large enough that the line was like, it requires your full and utmost attention, so we're going to provide you with a staff captain who is more affable and will relieve you of your social responsibilities. And this was a good thing because in 1915, the captain of the Lusitania had a lot more to worry about than entertaining some fancy folks. He had to worry about German U-boats. The submarines of the German Navy had become a plague on the shipping lanes, especially around Ireland and Britain. And in the days before Lusitania left New York for Liverpool, numerous warnings that U-boats were willing to strike passenger and merchant ships were making headlines. Now granted, these passenger ships were not just taking passengers over to the UK, but they were also taking supplies, food, even munitions to help them with their war effort, so some people say, well, they're fair game. Even then, people were like, you know, you're taking your chances. Even just a few days before Lusitania left New York, Washington, D.C. got a message from Germany saying, we are going to fire upon any ship that is flying a British flag, especially the Lusitania. And they printed this in the newspapers, saying travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Now personally, I would have probably canceled, but people then seemed to be undeterred. First of all, many people thought that Germany was bluffing, that they wouldn't actually attack a passenger ship. Second of all, Lusitania was very, very fast, and German U-boats are not very fast, especially when they're underwater. So there was no problem with Lusitania just outrunning a U-boat, provided they knew it was there. And while it's always hard to know exactly where a submarine is, there were warnings. Because just the day before she sank, around dinner time on May 6th, a warning came through to the wireless operators aboard Lusitania, saying submarines active off south coast of Ireland. Now the next day, on May 6th, only 16 hours away from their destination of Liverpool, lunch was served aboard Lusitania. And while nobody seems to have thought anything super out of the ordinary about the meal, some people did write about some things that in hindsight are rather important. At luncheon, the portholes in the dining saloon on Deck D were open, and so I doubt not that all the others on the deck were open. Here, let me state that I consider it most extraordinary that the portholes on the lower decks should not have been closed and sealed as we steamed through the war zone. And Charles Laureate was absolutely right, because should the worst happen and should the ship begin to sink, having all those portholes open would just hasten its demise by letting in more and more water. Another first-class passenger, Theodate Pope, who was dining with her friend, conveniently named Edwin Friend, recalled a young Englishman at our table had been served with his ice cream and was waiting for the steward to bring him a spoon to eat it with. He looked ruefully at it and said he would hate to have a torpedo get him before he ate it. We all laughed and then commented on how slowly we were running. We thought the engines had stopped. It had not stopped, but it kind of felt that way because, one, it was a very calm sea, and so there was less movement of the ship, but two, they had slowed down. See, the original order was to head straight for Liverpool, full steam ahead, but they had kind of mistimed it, and should they keep going at full speed, they would reach Liverpool too early and have to sit outside of the bay where they were just a sitting duck for a U-boat. So they slowed down to 18 knots. Now by 2:10 p.m., most of the first-class passengers had finished their meal, and the second seating of the second and third-class passengers was about halfway done, so they were all still eating. A lot of people had come up onto the decks. It was a lovely day, the sea was nice and calm, and that is when one of the crewmen, Leslie Morton, recalled. At 10 minutes past 2, I looked at my watch, and putting it into my pocket, I glanced round the starboard side, and as roughly as I could judge, I saw a big burst of foam about 500 yards away, 4 points on the starboard bow. That burst of foam was air leaving the torpedo tube of German U-boat U-20 as it fired a torpedo straight at Lusitania. And the sea was so calm that numerous passengers say that they were able to look into the water and see the torpedo coming at them. And it looked like chalk being drawn across the top of the sea straight toward the ship. One survivor, Oliver Bernard, told newspapers, "I was leaning against one of the windows of the Palm Lounge looking across an uncommonly calm and beautiful sea, brilliant in sunshine, when I saw on our starboard what at first seemed to be the tail of a fish. The next thing I observed was a streak of froth. We had all been thinking, dreaming, eating, sleeping submarine from the hour we left New York. And yet, with the dreaded danger about to descend upon us, I could hardly believe my own eyes. An American lady rushed to where I stood, exclaiming, 'That isn't a torpedo, is it?' I was too spellbound to answer. I felt absolutely sick. Then we were hit. Just below the ship's bridge, 360 pounds of explosives detonated, sending a geyser of water, wood, and steel shooting up into the air. A hole about 40 feet wide and 15 feet tall was ripped open in the side of Lusitania. Now those at the far end of the ship or in the center of the ship, all they felt was a dull thud. But those near the explosion had water and pieces of steel and the remnants of lifeboat number 5, which was blown to smithereens, raining down upon them. But regardless of where you were in the ship, very quickly, everyone felt the list as it started to take on water. Immediately after the explosion, the ship took a sharp list to the starboard and a decided pitch by the head. You could feel the two separate motions very distinctly. It seemed as if she were going down at once, but then she stopped suddenly, as if the sea had met the watertight bulkheads, and she seemed to right herself and even raise her bow a little. This gave me a feeling of security, and I at first thought she would stay afloat. But she would not stay afloat. Now, nobody at the time knew how long it would take, but only 18 minutes after being hit by that torpedo, Lusitania would be on the bottom of the ocean. Now, while he didn't know how long they had left, Captain Turner did act decisively and decided lifeboats is going to be the best bet. But he had to slow down the ship from 18 knots because you can't have lifeboats going down going that fast. So he ordered his men to reverse engines, which would quickly stop the ship, quickly being about 3 minutes, but they didn't respond. So at that point, he decided, okay, we're going to head toward shore. They were only 12 miles off the coast of Ireland. They knew they probably wouldn't make it, but at least he could beach the ship so it wouldn't sink. But unfortunately, because of the list and taking on so much water, she just wouldn't turn. So then he decided we just have to get in the lifeboats and slow down on our own, which can take up to a half an hour. Now inside the ship, first-class passenger Molly Mackworth, who had just finished having lunch with her father, knew something was wrong and so went straight to their rooms to get their life belts. And she went alone, but as she's going down the hall, she runs into a stewardess. And because it's just so English, she says, "We wasted a minute or so making polite apologies to each other." Now, by the time she actually reached the room, the ship was really starting to list, and she said it was hard to actually even stand, but she got the life belts and went up to the boat deck. Just after I reached the deck, a stream of steerage passengers came rushing up from below and fought their way into the boat nearest us, which was being lowered. They were white-faced and terrified. I think they were shrieking. There was no kind of order. The strongest got there first, the weak were pushed aside. They rushed the boat before it was ready for them. As we watched, I turned to an American girl. "I always thought a shipwreck was a well-organized affair." "So did I," she said, "but I've learned a devil of a lot in the last 5 minutes." Only 4 minutes after impact, all of the power on the ship went out. This left a lot of people in elevators stranded, and a lot of people down below decks in pitch black darkness trying to, in vain, very often, find their way up to the boat deck. Now you would think that people would be shrieking in sheer terror, but according to some, it was eerily quiet. A strange silence prevailed, and small, insignificant sounds, such as the whimper of a child, the cry of a seagull, or the bang of a door, assumed alarming proportions. Junior Third Officer Albert Bestick was trying to lower lifeboats, but he quickly realized that this was not an easy task. Because the ship was listing so much, the boats were swinging out away from the ship 5 to 8 feet. So you had to either crawl across deck chairs that they laid on there to get to the boat, or you had to run and leap into the boat. And if you didn't make it, it was a 60-foot fall into the water. Even worse off were the boats on the port side, which instead of swinging out, were coming in back toward the ship, and it made it virtually impossible to lower them at all. Lifeboat 20, which had about 35 people in it when they attempted to lower it, got snagged and pitched forward, dumping everyone out, falling 60 feet into the sea. Because of this, Captain Turner ordered that no more boats be lowered from that side of the ship. But Lifeboat 18 was already pretty much full with 40 women and children, and the sailor in charge was just standing there, following orders. And that's when a first-class passenger, Isaac Lehman, said, you have to lower this boat. And again, he said, these are my orders, I can't. So then Lehman takes out a pistol and points it at the young man. Don't you see the boat is sinking? And the first man that disobeys my orders to launch the boat, I shoot to kill. So, being confronted with a guy with a pistol, the sailor swung his axe to release the pin, and of course the boat did not swing out. It swung back in toward the deck and smashed some people up against a wall, killing them instantly, injuring many others, including Lehman, the guy with the pistol. It crushed his leg. Meanwhile, on the starboard side of the ship, Leslie Morton, who was the one who first saw the torpedo, was successfully lowering Lifeboat 11. And it was getting down to the water. The problem was, because they were still going like 4 or 5 knots, the lifeboat is kind of now drifting back beneath the next lifeboat, he says Lifeboat 13, which is being lowered. That boat's ropes were both handled by inexperienced men from one section or another of the catering or steward's department, and instead of being lowered away, the ropes went with a rush, and number 13 lifeboat, full of people, dropped 25 or 30 feet fairly and squarely into number 11 lifeboat, which was also full of people. Now, it was actually probably Lifeboat 9 that went down, but regardless of the number, it doesn't matter. It killed many of the passengers instantly. And later on, Morton recalled that all of this was happening in such a rush that seeing that tragedy happen, it was part of a larger unfolding tragedy, which did not give one time to waste in either horror or sympathy. And I was looking out, having no boat now to attend to see if I could get a glimpse of my brother. The turmoil of passengers and life belts, many people losing their hold on the deck and slipping down and over the side, and a gradual crescendo of noise building up as the hundreds and hundreds of people began to realize that not only was she going down very fast, but in all probability too fast for them all to get away, did create a horrible and bizarre orchestra of death in the background. And it was all but too late to get away from the ship, because as she went down, she would suck people and things with her, especially when the 4 great funnels started to go down. They were hollow, so as soon as they hit the water, water would pour in, just sucking everyone and everything in down with them. Though there were some passengers like Margaret Dwyer who was sucked down into the funnel, but then a moment later was shot up, covered in soot, as a big air pocket released and brought her up to the surface. One second-class passenger, Grace French, who was without a life belt, recalled being sucked down with the ship. It got blacker and blacker until it became calm and peaceful, and I thought I must be in heaven. The next thing I saw was the water getting lighter and lighter until I popped to the surface. I grabbed hold of a life jacket which had a dead young man in it. We floated together for a while until a big wave washed him away. All of this occurred in only 18 minutes. And of the 22 regular lifeboats on the ship, only 6 were successfully launched. There were some rafts and collapsible boats that people were able to get on when they washed off the ship, so they provided some haven for others. But in all, of the 1,959 passengers aboard Lusitania, 1,199 perished. And while the survivors were there less than 12 miles away from the coast of Ireland, it took 3 hours for anyone to come and get them, because there was still a U-boat out there. And so people were afraid to go rescue them. But after 3 hours, the survivors were taken from the water, and one of those survivors was actually the captain. He had gone down with the ship. He was in the bridge when it went under the water, but he was wearing a life vest, and he floated to the top, and he did survive. But one of my favorite rescue stories is actually of a family that was aboard the ship. It was George Hook, who was traveling with Frank and Elsie, his young son and daughter. And as the ship was going down, he decided that they would kind of stay on the ship for as long as they could and kind of hold tight to each other until finally they decided, all right, we're going to jump off. And they jumped off into the water, but still they were together. And then a lifeboat came crashing down upon them. And after that, the son was gone. They couldn't find him anywhere. And they searched and searched, and they couldn't find him anywhere. Now, in the days after the sinking, bodies were washing up on the Irish shore for days. And so George and Elsie would go and look at every single body to see if it was Frank, and none of them were. And then on day 3, somebody told them that there was a young boy in a nearby hospital who had a broken leg or broken hip from a falling lifeboat. So they went to the hospital and they opened the door, and there's young 11-year-old Frank sitting in bed, and his first words were, "Gee, Dad, took you long enough to get here." A little levity, kind of, after a really depressing event. And if you want more of the depressing event, then might I suggest watching videos from the channel Ocean Liner Designs. I'll link to one of my favorites, which is a minute-by-minute simulation of the Lusitania sinking. And you can watch it while you make the banana compote that you're going to serve with your Victoria pudding. Now, Agnes Marshall has a separate recipe in the same cookbook for this banana compote, and I figured it would be really simple. It's a little more complicated than I had expected, but here's how you make it. She says, take 2 mashed bananas and add 2 tablespoons of apricot jam and 2 tablespoons of maraschino syrup. Then add a few drops of red and a few drops of yellow food coloring. Then add in the juice of 1 lemon and the juice of 1 orange. Mix all of this together, and just like we did with the ice cream, pass it through a sieve. Then toss in 3 more bananas, which have been sliced into 1/4 inch thick slices. Coat them and then chill them in the refrigerator until your Victoria pudding is nice and frozen, which mine should be right about now. And here we are, a Victoria pudding as served on RMS Lusitania. So I gotta say, it is a beautiful dish. I'm not exactly sure how it would have been served on the ship, if it would have been one large thing that was brought out to the table or smaller portions. I don't know, but I'm gonna try it as it is. Just some of the ice cream first. That's really good. So the first thing you get is the banana, because there's a lot of banana in there. Oh, oh my gosh, there's so many layers. Because then you get like the super creaminess of it, and that's kind of what it coats your tongue. And then it is followed by the those floral flavors of like the orange blossom water and everything, but they're not overpowering at all. Oh, that's really good. All right, I'm gonna try it with some of the banana. I don't think you need to go to the trouble of making the banana compote. I mean, it changes the texture because now you're eating some banana, obviously. And if you want to, it's beautiful, it looks great, that kind of like vibrant red, but it doesn't really add to the flavor because it's a lot of the same flavors that are actually in the ice cream. So yeah, it's a lot of work, but it's absolutely worth it, I think, if you've got the time. Love it. While I was researching it, I had the question of, okay, now we know what they were eating on the Lusitania, but what were they eating on the U-boat that fired that torpedo? And so next week, we're going to talk about the experience of eating and living on a World War I U-boat, and specifically that U-boat that sank the Lusitania. So stick around for that next week, and I will see you